So we'll look at sexual reproduction in flowering plants. So when we talk about plants or flowering plants, we are essentially talking about the angiosperm family of plants in the plant kingdom. We're talking about angiosperms. They are the flowering plants. They bear flowers. Okay. So when we talk about when we talk about flowers essentially have 4 parts or 4 whorls, which are the petals, the sepal, and the male part of the plant, which is called the stamen, and the female one, which is called the carpel or the pistil. So out of these, the petals and the sepals are called the vegetative parts, which do not take part or which do not play an active role in sexual reproduction, and obviously the carpel or the pistil and the stamen are the reproductive parts, the female reproductive part and the male reproductive part respectively. Now, based on the presence of all these 4 whorls or all these 4 parts, the plant, any flower can be distinguished into 2 broad categories, the unisexual flower or a bisexual flower. So if a flower has both the male reproductive organ and the female reproductive organ in the same flower, then it is called a bisexual flower, as is the example here. So as you can see, there is the male, there is the female part, there is the male part, the petals and the sepals. So this is an example of a bisexual flower. Examples where we can see it in nature are the hibiscus or China rose, or mustard seeds, mustard flower. That also is a bisexual flower. In case of a unisexual flower, what will happen? You will have the petals, the sepals, but only one of the reproductive part. Either the flower will have the male reproductive part, making it a male flower, or it will have the female reproductive part, making it the female flower. Okay, some examples are the papaya flowers or watermelon. So, if we look into details of the structure of the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part, the male reproductive part is composed of 2 organs, which is the anther and the filament. The anther is basically the male reproductive part, which contains the pollen grains inside. Now, pollen grains contain the male gamete. Okay, and the filament helps in attaching the anther to the rest of the plant. Okay, if we look at the female part or the carpel or the pistil, it has 3 main components. It has the stigma, which is the opening at the top, the style, which is a long elongated tube, and the ovary. This entire thing is the ovary, where there is an ovarian wall and there is a ovule. There are ovules inside. Now this ovule will contain the egg, or which is the female gamete. So for fertilization to happen, the pollen grains which are present inside the anther need to come to the stigma. This process, traveling of the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma, is called pollination. Pollination again is of 2 types. If the anther from the same flower, if the pollen from the same anther drops onto the stigma of the same flower, then pollination happens, then it is called self-pollination. Cross-pollination, as the name suggests, is when the pollen from one anther, say of flower A, fertilizes the stigma of flower B, then it is called cross-pollination. Now, self-pollination can happen either by wind or some normal dehiscence, when the anther sheds the pollens directly into the stigma. But for cross-pollination to occur, you essentially need pollinators or pollinating agents, which can be wind. That means if the pollen tube can, the pollens can be simply transferred or via wind, or by insects or water, or even humans. Sometimes we also act as pollinators, or any other birds, or any kind of anything which facilitates in transfer of pollen from one flower to another flower, or within the same flower also. will be called pollinators or pollinating agents. The bright colors of the sepals or petals actually help in this pollination process, because it helps attract different insects or birds to the flower, so that the pollination process can actually go about smoothly. So one very good example is a bee. So when the bee sits, what does bee do? It takes the nectar from the plant. So when the bee sits to actually take the nectar, what it does, the pollen grains from the anther stick to the legs of the bees. And when the same bee goes and sits on another flower, then it transfers the pollen grain from its legs to the stigma of the next flower, in turn pollinating this new flower. Now, what happens when the pollen tube actually, the pollen grain sits on the stigma? So, the pollen grain contains the male gametes. Yes. So, when the pollen grain lands on a suitable stigma, it starts germinating the pollen tube. The pollen tube germinates and it reaches the ovule. The male gamete travels from the pollen grain to the ovule, where it gets fertilized with the female gamete and thereby forming the zygote. So this zygote, this is the entire process of fertilization. So what happens after fertilization? So after fertilization, we got the zygote, which after multiple rounds of cell division gives rise to an embryo, and this embryo in turn will give rise to your entire plant. Okay. The ovule, which contained the egg, gets converted into the seed, the hard seed that we see. If you open an apple, you will see the seeds inside. So inside the seed, inside that black hardened seed, there is the embryo, and the entire ovary is converted into the fruit. Okay. And what happens to the sepals and petals? So the sepals and petals can either fall off, or they shrivel in size and shrink in size and they become small. So this is your entire process of fertilization.